Hello and welcome back to HEMA Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be covering the Oslo Longsword 2024 finals match. Now, if you look down at the bottom of the video, you probably notice that this one's pretty long. And the reason for that is that Oslo has done something very interesting here with their finals match, given that it is a set of 3 matches rather than just one match. So normally when I cover a video or I cover a match, I get about, 5, maybe 10, maybe 15 exchanges. And I try to do my best to keep it short and keep it concise whenever I'm dealing with a match that lasted a really long time. But with this one, it's pretty much impossible. There are 3 of such matches, each with 10 plus exchanges, which means I'm dealing with almost 40 exchanges here. So if in previous times when you were watching my video, you would try to keep like a mental tally or, try to keep up with what's going on or keep a running score in your head, don't bother. It's not going to work out this way. I'm going to have to jump between exchanges that are sometimes minutes apart or take place in completely different matches. But the more important thing here is that because we have so many matches, we can focus on the really, really interesting ones and talk in depth about each one. Whereas before I might have to, skip over a few. So without any further delaying, this is going to be the first set of the match of the finals of Oslo Longsword Cup. So for our first exchange, we see a blueprint for what will eventually become the entire first set. Miro comes forward into range and throws his dominant shield out, the thing that he is probably best known for. And I would say about 50% of the time it lands, which gives him a high priority cut and tends to cancel out afterblows, as Oslo Penguin Cup appears to have a pretty tight afterblow timing. However, around half the time, Havard is able to parry this attack. And almost every single time he parries this attack, he's able to throw a counterattack that manages to get through. So the paradigm here is one that Miro is taking a very large commitment every time he attacks, but he's getting something for his commitment. He's getting deep target points. However, every time Havard manages to parry this attack, he's getting low priority commitments. He's getting the hand shots, arm shots, maybe even low priority body shots. And the problem here is that the paradigm is being set and the pace of the fight is being set by Miro from the offset almost every single time. Because of this, Miro spends most of this set of exchanges dominating that center line, dominating that offense, and seizing the vor and taking control of the fight. However, it is up to Havard to try to adapt to this, and further on in the fight, he does a pretty intelligent thing to try to do this. So this is the third exchange, actually not the second, but what's important to note here is that this is the time that Havard realizes that if he's going to try to stop Miro's forward momentum, he has to come at him with something threatening of his own. So, as Miro is walking directly into range, looking to throw his dominant shield how, as he always does, Havard tries to get into the timing and successfully throws a stop thrust directly to Miro's face as he's walking forward. And if you watch the footwork on this, you can see why it was so successful, where in other cases it might have only resulted in a double. You see, as Miro is coming forward, Havard tries to time the point at which Miro's right foot is coming off of the ground. And the idea here is that if you're going to throw the shield how the way Miro throws it, you want to throw it right as your foot is leaving the ground, which means that Havard knows that once his foot is off of the ground and moving through the air, that's not the time he's going to throw his shield how. So if he can throw his own thrust during that time, during that travel space when his foot is moving, he's going to probably land his thrust in a time where Miro is not even really throwing anything forward yet. As you see from the clip, of course, as Miro is traveling and he notices that thrust coming at him, he attempts to set it off by throwing his shield how, but it is too late and he gets thrust pretty hard right in the mask. Now, as you saw, because it's probably looped about 4 or 5 times now, Miro goes down after this and there's a long period where they have to wait. And it's almost a shame because Havard gave himself the formulaic win for how to get through this, and maybe it was just the stiffness of his blade, or maybe just a coincidence in how that blade managed to make contact with the mask in this particular time, that it made it seem like he was hurting Miro or punishing him, and as a result doesn't really utilize the stop thrust again for quite a number of exchanges, where it was really his solution to victory. So in a way it feels bad because despite the fact that Havard did everything right about trying to stop Miro's forward momentum, because he hurt him, he kind of dialed it back and started doing other tactics that of course didn't really work out for him quite as well. So for this next exchange, we see a little bit of this shift in tactics from Havard, but we see him also try to double down on parrying that initial shield hell from Miro. So what you see here is that as Havard is standing still, he is angling the left side of his crossguard up. And the reason he is doing this is that it creates a strong V shape so that when Miro throws his shield hell and it comes down on Havard's left side of his body, he can throw his Kron straight up into that spot and know that it's going to land directly into his crossguard and directly into the strong of his blade, which will give him an advantageous bind and parry, and maybe allow him to set that shield hell off to the side critically as much as it needs to before it hits him on the top of the head. However, despite the fact that this solution works and Havard is able to parry that shield hell, he throws a counter left Zverk low. And apparently in this rule set, body cuts are worth less than head cuts, as it is in plenty of rule sets. And Miro, knowing this, throws his shield hell and then immediately throws a right Zverk out of it straight to Havard's head, which allows him to get the better of a 1-point advantage in those matching afterblows and the double. So the problem here is that despite the fact that, as I said earlier, Havard has already learned what to do against the shield hell as the initial action, he has gone back to parrying and Zverking, which unfortunately isn't getting him the best of these exchanges. So far, and I've skipped a few exchanges, Miro has continued to use his dominant shield hell to basically get a couple of free points every once in a while, but more importantly, Havard has doubled down and continued to try to parry and repost this. And while he wins the occasional exchange this way, the problem is that because that shield hell, when it does land, gives Miro 2 free points, he's continued to widen the gap between these two scores. So this is the part where Havard once again tries to change tactics, and he once again changes back to the one that he used earlier when he hurt Miro. He goes back to thrusting. Now, in this particular exchange, he gets actually what I consider a little bit of bad luck. He goes for a stop thrust to the head, again, right as he feels like Miro is about to throw his shield hell, but rather than hitting him in the head, he actually gets his blade stuck in the hand, and he gets it stuck pretty deep. But while he only gets 1 point for this, it also shows a pretty good shift in his tactics. Because this stop thrust is once again using the same timing as we talked about earlier, where Miro is going to typically throw his shield hell as he's moving his back foot, he can get him in a situation where either his back foot is already extended forward or it's currently traveling through the air as a way of knowing that he is not going to be throwing that shield hell yet until his foot lands, which means it's the perfect time to throw that thrust. And that's exactly what happens here. Miro's foot is moving, he races his hands up to try to threaten with something, and he gets inadvertently stabbed in the hand as he moved it in front of his face. So a great shift in tactics, but unfortunately one that has come maybe a little bit later than it should have, as the gap is now pretty wide between these two scores. So we come now to the final exchange of the first set, and we see Miro make his first adaptation and deviation from his game plan. As soon as he steps forward, he threatens the high shield hell, as he's thrown almost every single exchange up till now, and it's a feint. Instead of throwing that full shield hell, he pulls it back and throws a very low but very nice right Zverk. And this right Zverk hits Havard directly onto the hands. Now, this is the last exchange, as I said, because these exchanges and these sets appear to go to 8 points. But what I want to point out here is that this is the first time that Miro has ever deviated from his game plan, and I want to talk a little bit about why you should never deviate from your game plan as long as it is working. As I said previously, Miro's game plan was working flawlessly because it put Havard in a position where he had to parry what was a very difficult shot to parry, and even when he did parry it, his follow-ups were not getting 2 points as opposed to the shield hell, which did when it was landing. So essentially, Miro had a game plan that put Havard into a downward spiraling loop of either getting 1 point or no points or getting 2 points against him. So the idea that Miro would change from this would seem a little foolish. But there are a lot of people out there who, when they throw an attack maybe 2 or 3 times in a row, they get in their own head and they start thinking that they should change up their tactics just because they assume that their opponent is going to start adapting to it. And I would say that that's actually not necessarily a good idea. You should always continue to do what has worked over and over and over again, no matter how many times it takes, because the simple fact here is that if you're doing something that works, it's on your opponent to adapt to you. And even if their adaptation ends up stopping you dead in your tracks, as it did to Miro, the fact that he was able to get up from that injury and continue to throw the exact same tactics over and over again shows you just how well he knows that this tactic is working and I should not deviate from this plan. A lot of people don't have the wherewithal or the mental capacity to understand that just because something has failed once doesn't mean it's going to continue to fail more. And just because it failed spectacularly does not mean your opponent has figured you out completely. So Miro, thankfully for him, stayed the course and continued to throw his favorite move over and over again from open, and is what won him this first set. Even though towards the end, Havard started to adapt against it by going back to thrusting, he wasn't able to close the point gap that had already existed. So even though there were a couple exchanges in there where Havard won specifically because he knew exactly what was coming and exactly what he wanted to do about it, it wasn't enough. And that's a good lesson for a lot of people in their own tournament fencing, because a lot of people, as I said before, will deviate from their plan for no other reason than they feel like they've done it too much. And as it says in a lot of other things, if you're winning, do not ever deviate, because you can't have enough points and you can't have enough of this good thing. So we come now to the first exchange of the second set, and we see Miro come out with, again, the same thing as he has done before. But this time we see a new adaptation from Havard. He comes in with the Schielhau, and immediately Havard simply throws a left spheric over the top of the blade, not really looking to parry at all, but instead take advantage of the fact that the Schielhau comes in at a far extension, and because it has a vertical crossguard, does not exactly protect the hands adequately. Instead, relying on his ability to walk backwards very, very quickly, Havard manages to keep just enough range to prevent that Schielhau from hitting him in the head, but doesn't quite get far enough that it doesn't hit him in the top of the hands. At the same time, though, that Zverkau comes in over the top of the blade and does manage to get around to the side of Miro's arm, resulting in a double. Now, normally I wouldn't really cover an exchange like this because it's not really all that important and it doesn't even result in any points. But one thing I want to make clear is that we see Havard taking completely different paths toward trying to deal with Miro's Schielhau, but at the same time, we're starting to see Miro realize that his Schielhau maybe isn't going to cut it for the entire length of 3 sets worth of exchanges, but instead of just the first one. Next up, we see the first real deviation from Miro in terms of his opening attack. Rather than come in with the Schielhau, again, as he's done before, he comes in with a thrust, and this thrust is pretty quickly set aside by Havard with his Kron parry. However, what happens after this is really weird and interesting. Havard does something really smart here, which is realizing that Miro has a lot of forward momentum and that he has pushed his hands up by doing a Kron parry. He, instead of trying to do any kind of Zverkau or any kind of real blade heavy attack, instead just grabs Miro's blade and pulls it backwards over the top of his head. Now, this is a thing that people can do anytime someone comes in way too hard with a thrust, because anytime you miss a thrust, you tend to keep your momentum going forward and run that missed thrust all the way to the hilt, resulting in both your hands and your opponent's hands touching each other. Meaning that you can't really throw a whole lot of great blade attacks out of this because the hands are going to get bound up. And if you watch some previous videos about Stephen Chaney, you'll notice that he takes this opportunity to do a hand shove to ensure that you can't do anything out of this. So what the result here is that Havard does something very smart, grabs that blade, pulls it down, and puts Miro in a position where he can basically do absolutely nothing with his weapon. However, at the end of this exchange, despite the fact that Havard had complete control of the blade this entire time, they give 1 point to Miro for a pommel strike. And normally I don't like talking about judges' calls during these kinds of videos, but I really want to point out that this call makes absolutely no sense. There is no opportunity here for Miro to throw any kind of pommel strike, because even at the time when his blade had gone all the way up, Havard's arms were in the way of any pommel strike. And once he let go with his arms and grabbed Miro's sword, there is absolutely zero ability for Miro to have pushed his blade forward in any capacity, meaning that the only kind of contact the pommel might have made with his opponent's mask was one in which Havard may have accidentally ran his own face forward far enough that it touched the pommel, but Miro would not have been able to throw any meaningful forward momentum with this strike and really couldn't call it a strike at all. More or less the fact that because Havard had pulled his blade over the back of his head, it caused the back end of his sword, his pommel, to lever upwards and might have scraped his mask incidentally as he did that. So pretty hard to disagree with the call on this, but at the end of the day, still a really interesting exchange. Next up, we see another adaptation from Miro, only this time it ends up working out for him, unlike the thrust from earlier. This time, Miro goes back to the same adaptation that you actually might have noticed he used towards the very, very end of the first set. See, Havard has been taking a stance that is getting more and more tailored to dealing with Miro's Shielhau, when basically trying to cron parry it as hard as humanly possible. But Miro, noticing this, immediately starts throwing a feinted Shielhau into a low right Zwerk. And the reason this is effective is because the more you try to cron parry, the more you have to start leaning backwards, moving backwards, and throwing your hands up into the air. And if you're precise enough, you can utilize this knowledge to throw low right Zwerks that come up at that 45-degree angle and basically ensure that you get underneath of the crossguard and hit your opponent in the hands. The only thing you have to know for sure is that your opponent is going to parry. And this is where all those Shielhaus are really starting to pay off again, not only for winning him the first set, but for driving it into Havard's brain that he has to cron parry every single time Miro's foot leaves the ground. And now he's starting to punish him for this habit. He is getting in those Zwerks underneath and he is getting his points. However, again, because these aren't headshots, his point lead isn't really going up very quickly. And as we're going to see now, Havard, realizing that Miro might be feinting on his first intention, is going to start taking advantage in a way that was similar to how Miro was gaining points in the first set. So it's been a few exchanges, and Havard has managed to get a little bit of a point lead by winning some nice parry riposts. But this is really the exchange where things start to shift for him. Because what we see here is Miro come forward with the exact same thing that we talked about before. That high feinted Shielhau into a low right Zwerk, intending to target the hands as Havard goes into a cron parry. But Havard does something very smart. He recognizes that Miro is going to feint that Shielhau, and he expects this low right Zwerk. And rather than try to parry it or really engage with that low right Zwerk, what he instead does is he does what I call the dolphin step backwards, where he sucks in his gut, shoots his legs backwards, and in this case, leaps into the air and throws a cut over the top. And the reason this is a smart option is because it takes advantage of the two problems of throwing a low right Zwerk to the hands. One, it's a low priority target, and managing to hit your opponent in the head is, while maybe feel a little bit gamey to the rule set, a pretty decent idea because anything that comes low has to go through up into the midline, and anything that you throw that comes down onto the top line has to also pass through that same space. So there's always a chance that you end up binding up in the middle while you hit them on top of the head. And there's a chance that you just get hit in the hands and you hit them on the head, which comes out to be a 1-point advantage most of the time. But also what's important is that by throwing his legs back and sucking in his gut, he's made it so that Miro has to throw this low right Zwerk significantly higher than he may be expected to, which results in it losing a lot of its momentum, but also a lot of its timing, which means that even though Havard more or less bit on the cron parry by, jumping into the air, it still managed to land his blow at the exact same time as he got hit in the hands by this low right Zwerk. So he shows that he's doing a really, really nice adaptation here and expecting Miro's afterblows and expecting Miro's feints. And he's coming in over the top and utilizing, as I said, that high priority targeting to take advantage of his point lead and continue to stretch it further and further. Now, this next exchange is the next exchange, and it features another really interesting adaptation. Miro comes forward, feints his high Shielhau as he did last time, but instead of throwing the low right Zwerk, he throws the high left Oberhau, the high left descending cut. And in this particular case, I gotta really give credit to Havard here because he somehow managed to predict this was coming and get a really clean cron parry out of this. As you know, whenever somebody feints at you, the hardest part about it is that they can throw a cut to any one of your 4 quadrants, even low to your leg, and you don't really know what thing is coming. So you have to stand there in your defensive posture and hope that sometimes you either guess the correct defense or just have the reflexes to be able to see what's coming and respond to it. Despite the fact that Miro had been feinting high and then going low on his left side, Havard managed to not let it get into his head that that was going to happen again, and instead of instinctually parrying low or just going in high again as he did in the previous exchange, he waits just long enough to see what Miro is going to throw and parries high on his right side, as far as I can tell, for the first time in 2 sets. So he gets his cron parry off and he throws a very nice left Zwerk, this time high towards the headline, which unfortunately, due to the angle of certain things, just lands on the top of the shoulder. However, it seems like the judges don't think that this was quite enough quality, and judging by the footage, I can't really tell whether or not if it made meaningful contact or if it just got arrested by the guard 90% of the way. But the point being is that Havard has made a really intelligent adaptation here that is probably going to be able to carry him through so long as he is able to continuously rely on Miro's initial feints and read his follow-ups from those feints and either guard or attack over the top. So we're now at the final exchange of the second set, and as you can see by the score, it's tied up 6-6. Miro, in the previous exchange, was able to get a really nice hand shot, but this is the slightly more exciting and the more interesting thing to call, and as a result, it's going to decide the outcome of the second set. So Miro comes forward and feints a high Shiohao yet again, and yet again, he throws a high left cut instead of a low right cut, trying to get around the expectations of Havard. However, this time, rather than parrying high in the Kron parry, it seems like Havard did something even more wacky. He threw his hands higher up into the air and parried Miro's left side strike with his crossguard or the strong of his blade as he was kind of flat pushing his sword out there. And what he does in response as a counterattack, in my opinion, is a bit of a mistake. Rather than throwing his short edge back down that same line, he instead makes a little bit of a mistake and shoves his flat directly down the line onto the top of Miro's head. Now, Havard is obviously a little bit taller than Miro, and several times now, as Miro has come forward, Havard has jumped into the air in order to get an even more dominant angle on that high line. And it is because of this jump and his, increased height that he is able to throw what, again, appears to be the flat side of his blade directly down the path of the sword and tap Miro on the top of the head, despite the fact that Miro has shoved his Kron parry all the way up to the level of his eyebrows. Now, in my opinion, this strike isn't quite good enough, though it is what the judges call. But immediately after the strike lands, Miro does something else that I actually found really interesting, which is that he drives his pommel up into the gap that is now created by Havard's heightened height, and then throws that pommel straight to the face and drives him out of the ring. Now, a lot of people would say that this is maybe just a little bit excessive or that it wouldn't really have a lot to it, but it's actually, in my opinion, one of the best options for Miro here. Because Havard has consistently tried to get over the heightened line of Miro's guard, Miro has to then drive up at a 45-degree angle in order to get his defenses high enough to protect the top of his head. So by driving his sword forward and then up and then backwards over the top of his head, he's actually getting his crossguard into the position where it can best parry a blow that's going to come straight down onto the top of his head. And at the same time, he's driving his pommel forward, which is going to force Havard backwards and hopefully punish him for leaping into the air where he can no longer control the position of his body, so much so that he might either land directly back on top of that pommel as he comes back down, or at the very least be in a position where he has to continue to retreat and might retreat his way completely out of the ring. So a really great response. Unfortunately, in my opinion, a called shot that didn't really have enough to it, but it does result in a win for Havard, which means that they are tied 1-1, and now we have a third set to go through. So we're now to the third set, which means that the winner of this set is going to win the whole thing. And starting off with our first exchange, we see another repeat of the same kind of thing that we saw towards the end of the second set. Miro is feinting high once again and then throwing a long edge cut on his high left side onto Havard's high right side. And Havard is doing a very interesting technique here to try to cancel that out, which is essentially, rather than parry in any meaningful way, he's jumping up into the air and throwing a low right Zwerchhau, which, despite it being low, because he's jumping into the air, is actually landing high. It's a really interesting way of trying to deal with the situation, and where before I mentioned that when it paired with a Kron parry, didn't actually result in a edge-on hit, at least as far as I could tell. This time, they're coming down edge-on, and they're coming down with a pretty decent amount of structure, which is, again, unusual for someone who is jumping into the air, one, and two, trying to shelter themselves from a descending cut with a right hanger parry that is trying to get the edge on at the exact same time. A lot of the times when you try to do this technique yourself, what happens is the force from the left Oberhau of your opponent is going to jostle your hand and jostle your wrist so badly that you lose your edge alignment and you end up just throwing some garbage at their head, at which point they, as Miro does, come in and try to get into a grapple situation. Because when you finish a right Zwerch, your right hand is very far forward, which means your ability to pull it off without getting tangled in something is basically gone. So Lucky for Havard here, he's managing to pull off this jumping right Zverev attack, and it's working out for him, and it's going to be the pattern for this set, as Miro doesn't seem to be adapting very much anymore and continues to throw this same kind of attack pattern over and over again while Havard takes advantage. Now, I've skipped 3 exchanges, and you'll probably notice by looking at the score that it's tied at 1-1. And if you're wondering how 3 exchanges could have gone by and only one person have scored a point, well, the answer is that both of these fencers are, quite forgivably getting very tired, and they're kind of running out of adaptations to make against each other. They've already adapted 2 or 3 times to their simple patterns, and now they're getting to the point where they're having to go back and redo a lot of previous concepts because they've just been doing it for so long that they've kind of adapted their way back to the very beginning. And, as I said earlier in the very beginning, one of the best ways to deal with Miro's forward momentum is to make sure that you have a threatening point. And here we see Havard repeating the past, and as Miro comes forward and has lost a lot of the spring in his step, to getting stabbed directly in the face as he ducks under his blade and just stabs him there. The reason this works, of course, is that as Miro was coming forward, he recognized the threatening tip of Havard, slowed his roll a little bit, and Havard took advantage of that slowed momentum and lack of attack to duck over onto the offside of his thrust parry and just dial one in. And as he did so, Miro, instead of simply throwing an attack back, tried to parry, which he was unsuccessful in doing, resulting in a clean 2 points for Havard. But again, as I said earlier, people are starting to get tired, it looks like, and as a result, Miro's ability to seize the vor and come in with a very strong attack doesn't seem to really be there anymore, while Havard is still jumping around and getting the high line, which means that he might have had a little bit of a better cardio here, and he's utilizing that advantage pretty effectively. Now, next up, we have another really interesting exchange where we see Miro finally able to deal with the jumping low right Zverev that actually lands high because he's so tall technique that Havard has been using. But what we see is another illustration of something that will actually come up later, which is that when Havard is jumping in the air, he's jumping off of one leg. If you watch this back a little bit slower, what you notice is that as Havard jumps, his right leg more or less doesn't really leave the ground very far. It kind of just only comes a couple inches off, while his left leg goes kind of flying into the middle range. And you're going to find out why that's important in a little bit. But for right now, as he throws his low right plunging Zverev while leaping, Miro is able to put his hands just completely on top of his head as a way of parrying that blow and tries to go into a little bit of a grapple. Unfortunately, Havard, after jumping, isn't really arrested in any way, so he then creates more distance, and as Miro comes back in to try to re-engage, throws a low left Zverev which hits Miro on the hands. A pretty clean exchange, but one where we're starting to see Miro find the cracks in this technique that Havard has been utilizing so effectively. So here we see Miro exploit the cracks in a technique and really dial it up into a full-blown fissure. What happens is Havard comes forward and feints the exact same thing that he has been doing over and over again, where he jumps up in the air and throws that plunging right Zverev, only this time he throws it to the left side. Now, in a lot of ways, this doesn't really matter much because the response from Miro is exactly the same as if it had come on the right side. He throws his hands on top of his head and basically points his crossguard backwards. Because of how close and how heightened the shot is coming from, by pointing his crossguard backwards, he's essentially giving it a place to fall into that isn't his head, even though more or less it would come down onto the side of his ear every single time if he didn't put his hands there. So he manages to parry the plunging Zverev, and this time he follows it up with the pommel strike, which we talked about earlier. Now, I talked about it a little bit then, but I want to go into a little bit more detail as to why this is such a smart option. You see, because there's not a lot of advantages to be had when you're the shorter fencer in an exchange, and certainly not a lot of advantages when the taller fencer is trying to augment their already heightened state by jumping into the air. So by coming in through the middle and at this 45-degree angle with this pommel strike, it does two things. One, it puts your hands naturally in the position where you can parry strikes coming from that high, as we're seeing Miro do, but also because when you're driving upwards as well as forwards with your pommel strike, it has the added benefit of splitting the hands of your opponent. As you see here, when Havard lands, or doesn't land in this case, his left Zverev, immediately that pommel strike comes up through the middle, and immediately you see Havard's hands separate from his sword. The reason this happens is because as Miro drives forward, Havard's hands have nowhere to go but up, because after he has landed his strike and it has not been successful, if he tries to pull backwards, he's going to essentially get his hand split by the fact that Miro's blade is still in the way. And if he wants to get his blade over the top of Miro's, he has to separate his hands. Otherwise, he's effectively going to just try to rake his sword up Miro's all the way to its point before he can escape from this position. So because Miro has come in between his hands with his pommel strike, he's created a situation where Havard has to take hands off of his sword in order to continue the exchange. And that means that not only can he not really defend himself from the pommel that's coming at him, but it also means that even if he wanted to defend himself from the pommel, he'd still have to do so with his offhand, and he'd still have to figure out something to do with his dominant hand with now only one hand on his sword. So a really great response. It looked a little aggressive and a little mean, but I promise you that a two-handed pommel strike is never really as dangerous as a one-handed one. As I stated before, the ability for a pommel strike to do damage has a lot to do with its travel. And because what Miro did really here was place his pommel onto Havard's mask and then push, it looked a lot meaner than it really was, and it probably didn't do a whole lot of damage. Thankfully, because at this point, Miro is the one who's been injured, I think, twice, and Havard has been getting away with some pretty wacky stuff. So next up, we're going to watch an exchange that actually doesn't result in any points, but it does result in a warning. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because this warning comes into play later on. But right now, what you see is that Miro is struggling a little bit with a point lead from Havard, because Havard has still managed to use this jumping, plunging strike to get a couple of key points. But for the most part in this third set, there's just been a lot of doubles that result in nothing, and a lot of exchanges being thrown out, again, likely because both fencers are getting a little bit tired. But what we see here is something a little bit different, and something that is going to come into play later. So we see the exact same plunging strike, we see the exact same parry from Miro, we see another attempted pommel strike that doesn't really quite land. But what happens after that is that at the separation, I mentioned earlier that Havard had to figure out what he was going to do with his hand, only one being on the sword, when they go and separate from this pommel strike. So despite the fact that the pommel wasn't called, even though it pretty much had the exact same setup and payoff as last time, as they separate and the ref calls halt, Havard is already couching a one-handed cut to Miro's head. Now, this lands really, really late, and I can understand why it happened. Havard really needed to figure out what he was going to do with that blade, and this is just what he came up with. It just so happened that the one-handed cuts have to have so much wind-up that it slowed it down to the extent that it made it land seem like, you know, he did it on purpose afterward as a kind of punishment. But I don't really think that's what happened here. I'm almost 100% sure this was an accident. But again, it did result in a warning. And we're going to see the consequences of that warning coming up now. So we're about to see the consequences of our own actions here, and we're going to see a payoff to some foreshadowing I made a couple of exchanges ago. You see, Miro comes forward, not really with any feint or any real attack at all, simply just waiting for that plunging, jumping Zverkow, which Havard throws. And this time, we see the consequences of the fact that when Havard jumps up, as I said before, on one leg, his left leg just kind of starts wiggling around in a lot of weird places. Wiggling around this time in such a way that he accidentally throws a flying knee strike into Miro's chest. Now, Miro, to his credit, takes it like a champ and, walks back to his corner and takes his warning. But you might remember, again, because Havard already has a warning, it results in a point deduction, which takes a now lead that Havard had going into this into a negative lead. So in the course of two exchanges, Miro has managed to catch up and now take a points lead, and now we go into the final exchange of the set. So it all ends with this, and it's not a particularly exciting exchange, but it is the last one. Havard comes forward with a thrust that he tries to wind over onto the offside again, only for Miro, who is not trudging forward this time, to simply Kron parry it out of the way and throw a very nice left Zverik out of that. Havard does a pretty great job of getting his parry in the way, but doesn't quite do a good enough job, as that Zverik was properly structured and manages to blow through enough of Havard's guard to hit him on the head, giving Miro 2 clean points and the win, as apparently this exchange and this set had gone so long that they had run out of clock time, and despite the fact that no one had reached 8 points yet, this was the final exchange. So Miro has won the final set, he has won 2 sets, and he has won the match. So he has won gold medal at the Oslo Penguin Cup. But it was pretty hard fought. There was a lot of times in there where Havard could have maybe changed up his tactics a little bit, or realized that Miro had out-adapted him and changed it up, maybe gone back to a thrust game and gotten the better of it. And also, something that I didn't show, is that Havard threw out a lot of his own points during this final set. And if you remember what I feel about self-calling, there are definitely a couple of those situations where he made the right call by self-calling something of his own, but there was also one or two times where he made the wrong call because he felt something that he thought was sufficient, but actually wasn't deemed sufficient by the judges. So in a lot of ways, Havard had the ability to win this exchange going into this if he simply hadn't self-called enough times to lower his by, I think, almost 2 or 3 points. So, maybe another thing he could change about his game plan going forward. But overall, a really cool fight, a lot of adaptations, and I think a good demonstration of why having enough exchanges can give you really interesting fight dynamics where people have to adapt to each other over and over again. Perhaps 3 sets is a little bit much, as clearly the fencing was starting to degrade towards the end of the 3rd set, as it got very doubly and people got very tired, especially also considering that poor Miro got beat up quite a lot of times in these 3 sets, so he was dealing with something a little bit more than maybe most people would have to if it had only gone to like 10 or 15 exchanges. But really interesting stuff. If you'd like to see more footage featured on the channel, feel free to send it. I got the email linked in the description, and I'll see you on Thursday.